Everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar titled Using Data to Inform Your Website. We appreciate your attendance. And I want to let you know that today's webinar is one webinar in a series of webinars that are designed to bring you information about consumer ed and resources in order to help you enhance your website. Today's webinar is one of a series that runs through December, so there'll be plenty of opportunities for you or your staff to participate in a variety of webinars on different topics. Today's topic is using data to inform your website, and it'll be a mix of best practices and also required elements of a consumer education website. The goal with all of these websites is to give you ways in which you can enhance how different stakeholders, including families, child care providers, and others experience your website. Our next webinar will be called Top 10 Actions to Improve Your Website, and it will be scheduled for August the 8th, and we hope that you can participate in that one as well. There was an announcement that came out announcing these webinars so that you can alert your staff, the particular staff that may be needed on these webinars, to attend. Some of the webinars, and actually today's, is a little technical in nature, so sometimes it may be that if you're a program person, you might want to invite your IT staff or other staff to participate so that they can also take full advantage of the webinars. During today's webinar, we would like to ask you to use the chat feature to type in questions that you might have on this topic. We will remind you throughout the webinar to use this feature for questions. What we're going to do with those questions is we will take those questions and sort through them, and then in 2 weeks, on July 25th, from 2 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we will answer as many questions as we can in a follow-up webinar called Ask Me Anything. However, if you think of a question after today's webinar, it's fine. You can still email us, and we're going to give you an email at the end of the webinar, and you can send in your email through that vehicle as well. I'm going to take a minute to introduce the speakers and the presenters that we have on the call today. First of all, I am Christy Lewis, and I am an early education system consultant with the State Capacity Building Center, and I work with specific states around actually their consumer education websites. And then two of my colleagues that are on this call are Darren Goldberg and Josh DeLong, and both of them work in our digital strategy platform work, and I'm really happy to have both of these gentlemen on the call with me today. At this time, we're going to do a poll, and we'd like to take just a minute for you to answer the question so that we can kind of get an idea of what audience is on the webinar today. Okay, great. I think that we're ready to close the poll, but it looks like that the large percentage of people that are on the call today are actually people who are working in a state government capacity. And then we also have some training and technical assistance professionals with us today too. So great, thank you all for being here today. We're going to begin the presentation, and I am actually going to turn it over to Josh, and Josh is going to talk with you all about increasing your search engine optimization. So take it away, Josh.
Okay, great. Thanks, Christy. So hi, this is Josh DeLong. I'm going to talk a little bit about search engine optimization today. and kind of what that means for your consumer education websites. So today I'm going to talk briefly about search engine optimization and kind of give you some information about what is it, if it's a new concept for you, or maybe you've heard about SEO but you haven't really had a chance to dive in and learn more about it. I'm going to tell you what it is and why it's important, as well as what some of the processes are that you might undertake to increase the search engine optimization or SEO for your website, what metadata are and why they're critical to SEO, and what just some small things are that you can do to ensure a better approach to SEO for your website. So let's jump in. So what is it and why should you do it? So search engine optimization is exactly what it sounds like. It's optimizing your website so that search engines, so when I say search engines, I'm talking about sites like Google and Bing, so that search engines can better find the content that's on your website based on what your users, your consumers, your partners, different people who are audiences for your website are searching for. And so again, we're just optimizing for those search engines because most visits come to websites through search engines these days. In some cases, you may have a lot of direct traffic if people are coming, typing the URL in directly to your site in some scenarios, or they're getting directed to your website through paid media or other marketing tactics like newsletters and things like that. But for most websites, generally, that's not how the vast majority of visitors get to them. It's typically through search engines because people tend to use the web, the modern web, in a way that's task-based. And so they have a task that they want to complete or a question that they want answered. And really the easiest way for them to get there is to go to a search engine and type in their question. And so that's what we're seeing in terms of the majority of traffic coming to websites. And so that's why making sure that you're optimized for those engines so that when they are conducting a search, that your website is set up and kind of configured so that the search engine is more likely to direct them to your site than to some other site that maybe isn't as credible or as useful to them, but the search engine doesn't know that yet if it's not optimized. So that's really what we're talking about, and it's really about making sure that your website appears to be relevant and engaging, not just to your users, but to the machines, to the algorithms that sites like Google and Bing use to look at your website and determine what's on it in relation to specific phrases and that searchers might be using online and questions that they might have. So that's really what we're talking about today. So there are really two components that make up search engine optimization. So when you're looking to optimize your site for SEO, you can think of it in two branching paths, really. One being what we call technical SEO, and these are changes that you make to your website that may not actually be visually apparent to most people who look at the website. These are really metadata, which we're going to cover in a moment what those are and what that means. But these are basically changes you're making to the code of your website behind the scenes to the metadata that tell the different robots and algorithms crawling your website. And when I say crawling, it means essentially they're scanning the website automatically for the search engines like Google and Bing to look for specific things and to rank your website against all the other websites on the internet for the different search terms and phrases that people are using. So technical SEO is really, are we including the right things to make those algorithms, to make those machines find what we want them to find when they look at our website, when they crawl it? The other side of it, aside from the technical SEO piece, is what we call content SEO. And so this is really what we're looking at when we do link building from other sites. We're doing content marketing. We're perhaps generating content that's new and relevant to our audience based on current trends or questions they may need answered. But it's also getting people from other credible websites to link back to us, because then that shows search engines that our site is credible and that we're kind of a recognized source for the information, which makes our SEO better. It makes our ranking go up. It makes us appear higher on search engines results pages. And so having that useful and usable and relevant content is actually the most important part of search engine optimization. If you do that, you're going to be in pretty good shape typically. The technical SEO piece is really more about making sure you're not doing harm to your search engine optimization and harm to your ranking. So for example, if you're missing a particular meta description, which we'll go into more detail in a moment about what that is, it might make it harder for the search engine to crawl your site and figure out what that page is about without that meta description. And so you've there done some harm to your SEO and perhaps ranked that page more lowly than some of the other pages it might be competing with on the rest of the internet. And so these are two different ways to think about SEO. Again, technical SEO is about really optimizing things behind the scenes, making sure you're not harming your search engine ranking. And content SEO is about, once you've got those basics down, you're now actually doing some content marketing using relevant content to your users that's going to make you appear to be a more credible source to search engines. So I mentioned metadata. And so what are they? So metadata are if you think of it as content as data, it's really a type of structured content that appears to the machines from the different search engines that are crawling your website. It's information that appears to those, and it also appears quite often on the search engine results page. So if you think about, if you go to a search engine like Google, for example, and you type in something and you click go, and you get that page of results with all the links. That's what we call the SERP, or the search engine results page. And so when we're looking at a SERP, you may have noticed before that you have that big link at the top that has the title of the page, and then there's usually some kind of grayed text that's a description underneath that. And it's usually a little short description about what's on that page. And that's what we call a meta description. Now, if you've ever seen a page in your search engine results page that you've ever seen a link that doesn't have a very helpful page title, it doesn't seem relevant, or the meta description is just kind of a vague description of the organization that owns the website, or it's missing, it's not there at all, you may already know how frustrating it can be for a user who may not see that information if you don't have it on your website or if it's not optimized. So even if Google can find your page, it's possible that it's still not going to get clicked on if it appears in results if it's missing some of this information. So the metadata, at the end of the day, they're mainly things that robots read when they crawl the site, when an automated robot is reading the site and kind of the behind-the-scenes code. That's mostly what these are, but they do contribute to some of the things that you see on the search engine results page. I do mention alternative text or alt text here as well. Although that doesn't typically appear on your search engine results page, it is a type of metadata, an HTML attribute, that if there's a non-textual element, say for example an image on your website, if that image sometimes doesn't load, if someone is using a screen reader to access the site and they can't actually see the image but they need the text read aloud to them, that alt text describes some of those different attributes and elements of the site. And so that's also a type of metadata, just to keep in mind. So we've talked a little bit about what is SEO, what are the different types of SEO, and why should you do it. And we've talked about metadata and how those are important to SEO and what they are. But if you actually, now that you know what these things are, want to get started yourself on looking at your own website and figuring out what is the current state of SEO for my site, and then how do I improve it once I know what that state is, that's what we're going to talk about next, is what some of the process is around this. And so it's really a three-step process if you want to simplify it. It's really about auditing the site, and what I mean by auditing is you're going to see what's the current state of what we have in terms of SEO. Then you're going to fix the SEO errors that you find, and that often involves some writing of new metadata. And then, of course, once you implement those things, you're going to want to measure it and make sure that you did it correctly and that your efforts have paid off. So I'll first talk about that first of the three steps, the SEO audit. Again, when I say crawl of the website, what I really mean is that you're using some kind of machine to automatically run through all the URLs of the website, all the pages on your site, and scrape those URLs and the related metadata for each one of those pages. So it's a little technical, but there are plenty of tools out there that could help you do this in an automated way. If you do a search for SEO spiders or SEO audit tools or SEO crawl tools online, you'll see that there are several out there. Some are paid, some are free. Some of them are free up to a certain amount of pages. So depending on your unique needs and the size of your website will depend on the tool that's right for you. But it's pretty easy to go out there and do a little bit of research and find a tool that can do this automatically for you. Some content management systems also have a way to export all of this information for you. So for example, if you're using a Drupal content management system site, you can often get an export of all the pages and their associated metadata fairly easily. So once you've run this crawl and you have a listing, essentially a spreadsheet of all of these pieces, you then want to sort the different pages or URLs by response codes. And so response codes are a name for the type of code that a website has associated with it if there's an error. And so these are error response codes that can help you identify different things. So if you've ever landed on a web page before that doesn't load and has a broken link, you may have actually seen the number 404 pop up. Sometimes people's broken link pages will actually say 404. So that's the response code. That 404 is an example of a response code for a broken link. So by sorting your spreadsheet of URLs first by the response code column, you'll find out really quickly where you have broken links and those types of errors and need to make some fixes and maybe even delete some old pages. Google actually takes these types of error codes into account when ranking your website. So just by getting rid of some of these, you can improve your search engine optimization. You then want to define the scope of your audit using your web analytics data if you have that available. And what I mean by that is it doesn't make sense necessarily to go in and fix the SEO on every single page of your website, especially if you have a large website with hundreds of pages. So you may want to scope down your audit a little bit by looking at your web analytics data and seeing, oh, you know what, from month to month, we only really have visitors to these top 25 pages. After that, we have very few people who come to the other pages on our website. At that point, you probably don't need to include those other pages that are less relevant to your audience in your audit. And you may even want to look at, can you consolidate or delete some of those pages? Because again, Google factors that into their ranking algorithm. If you have what they call index bloat, which essentially means you have a bunch of pages that no one ever goes to, your site will get dinged and rank lower in search results. You want to then look for pages within your scope, once you've determined it, that are missing metadata, and so they don't have any of those page titles or meta descriptions in them at all. Or that perhaps have metadata that's not really efficient, or that's duplicated from page to page, or that's irrelevant. And so an example of that is many content management systems have an automatic feature where they just populate either the same meta description in every new page that you create, or they take the first 150 or whatever it might be for that content management system characters and automatically populate that into the meta description. And so you often get an introductory sentence from the page that cuts off in search results that's not really relevant to describing what's on the page, or you get the same meta description across multiple pages on your website, which a search engine algorithm looks at and says, oh, these are all the same, I can consolidate them into one result, and suddenly you have lots and lots of pages that are no longer included in the crawl by the search engine. So it's really important to, once you've decided how much of the website you're going to look at, how many pages, and you've looked at which ones are missing metadata that need metadata written for them, to also look at what are some ones that may have duplicated or irrelevant metadata that's not describing the content appropriately. And I'm going to talk in just a minute more in depth about these different types of metadata and exactly what they should look like. So you've completed your audit. It's time to, once you know what you need to fix and write in terms of metadata, it's time to jump in and do that is the second step here. Again, as I mentioned before, you want to remove old links and error codes. You want to make sure you have metadata that is titles, links and headings that are accurate and descriptive, and make sure that everything's just really clear and concise and using plain language. It's also really helpful to make sure your URLs are very brief and clear. So often you'll see URLs that have a lot of weird characters included in them. They're extremely long. It's typically best if your URLs follow the same pattern as the site architecture. So for example, if you have a section on professional development and there's a page within that called webinars, then it might be whatever.gov/development/webinars, right? It's very simple. It matches the architecture of the site. There's not a bunch of weird characters in it, that sort of stuff. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about brief, clear URLs. And again, this is a search engine ranking factor as well. I should mention here real quickly that you want to write for people and not search engines, because the algorithms have gotten so good with search engines that they essentially do read these sites the same way that people do, and they will penalize you if they think that you're trying to game the system and kind of stuff keywords everywhere. So we used to tell people, hey, your websites not only need the title and the meta description, but you need to make sure that you fill in all these meta keywords as well. We actually don't recommend that anymore as SEO professionals, because it tends to have the opposite effect. Again, I mentioned this earlier, but I just want you to see this before we dive into how to fix and write some of these things, what they look like on a search engine results page. So again, you can see these three pieces of metadata here. The page title, the meta description is that sentence there in gray. You can see the URL structure is also very clean and simple here as well. And then they've taken the extra step, because they are Google in this example, of including some different heading tags that also display as sublinks. So starting with page titles, in terms of writing new metadata, just some general tips here. You want to keep the titles under 55 characters and 5 words. Your keywords should be towards the beginning of the title, so it's really easy for a user to scan down through search results and figure out what the page is about. And you also want to make sure that you're not creating any confusion with other content on the site. Sometimes I see page titles that are duplicated, or they're really similar. There might be an intro page, a welcome page, and an about page all on the same site. And typically those types of things are going to confuse users as well as search engines. So you can see an example here of an old page title that was really long, and it was kind of serving as more of a description. It was getting cut off in search results. And then it got revised to just a really succinct action and task-based title that starts with the word search, and then it gets into what are they searching for and in which state. So after titles, I'll talk about meta descriptions. So again, these are those little gray descriptions that you see in the search engine results page. They play a really big role in what search engines are looking for. when they're crawling the site and ranking it. Again, these should be in plain language. They should build on the title and make sense with it. They need to be under 155 characters. Typically, one of the problems a lot of folks have is their meta descriptions are much longer than that. They get cut off. They don't get completely crawled, and they're just way too long. So you want to keep them under 155 characters. And again, if somebody's not going to read the whole description, make sure that the beginning of it has kind of the primary words and phrases in it, so it's easy for people to scan through, and they'll be more likely to click on that link in a search engine results page. So just like with the title, we have a example here. So again, they're not page content. They should not be ridiculously long. They should just give a real succinct description of what's on the page. They should not try to deliver the content that's on the page. They're really describing what the page is about, not delivering the information that's there. You also want to make sure that it's not all about the organization that the page comes from or that the page is about, or it's not some technical or policy language. Those types of things really aren't good for meta descriptions, and they tend to get duplicated all over the place. But really keep it about the specific content on that page, and keep in mind that any user from the internet can enter your website into any page at any time through a search engine. So real quickly, I'll go through a couple of other quick fixes for search engine optimization. I won't go into great detail about all of these for time's sake. But if you're looking at your SEO process, a couple of other things you may want to do is to submit a sitemap for your website to a couple of the search engines. Google and Bing tend to be the most popular that most folks use, and we see the most traffic coming into websites through. You want to make sure that you have a robots.txt file that's been submitted to Google Search Console and Bing Webmaster Tools. What that does is it tells the search engines which pages to show and not show in its crawl. And so, for example, if you have a page that you don't want to appear in search results, you would have a no-follow instruction in this to tell the search engine not to index that particular page. And then another really important piece that sometimes goes under the radar is the page speed of the website. So there's actually a free page speed insights tool from Google that you can use to test this out, and it'll check and see how long it takes for the pages on your website to load. A lot of that hinges on things like how your images are stored and in what formats, but again, this is another part that people can't really see on the surface, but that greatly impacts ranking factors as it relates to search engines, is how fast the pages on your site actually load. They're given preference if they're faster pages. I talked a little bit before, so I won't go in great detail here about URL structure, but again, you can see the example there of the really long kludgy URL and then the revised, very simple URL. Mobile optimization is also a big factor in SEO. So since 2015, mobile-friendly websites actually get preference in Google's algorithm. And so we see different errors that often appear in websites, such as touch elements overlapping. So this might be two different buttons on a website that on a mobile device they touch each other, so the user can't actually select one of the buttons. The content might be too small, or the text might be too small. So the content in terms of photos, they may spill off the edge of the screen, or they may get sized inappropriately on a mobile device. So this is really just stuff that you have to test. A lot of folks like to design their website mobile first from the ground up and make it responsive initially, and then as you scale up to larger screens, you don't have an issue because you've already accounted for kind of the stacking and responsive nature of it. There are some free mobile friendliness tests out there you can run, including one within Search Console, which is part of the Google Suite. And it's really important to test websites for mobile optimization because, again, this is another area that may not be seen by everyone initially, but it really affects search engine ranking. And of course, we have seen a large spike over the last few years in terms of the number of users who use mobile devices instead of desktop devices to access the web. And in fact, on just about all of the websites that we work on, that number is now over 50%. Over half of folks are using mobile devices. And then finally, the third step, so if you remember the audit and then fix, and then you want to measure it is the third and final step. And you want to make sure that you continuously measure. It's not just about benchmarking and measuring one time, but you really have to keep measuring over time and track the pages where you're making technical and other SEO improvements, and then measure how much more organic search traffic. Again, that's non-paid, so I think most folks are probably not using paid search campaigns. So that organic just means it's non-paid referrals coming to your website from search engines. You want to measure the increases after you've made those improvements. The thing is that Google or Bing has to run their robots and recrawl the website again to really have these changes start to take place. And then I mentioned before, as pages build more links to them, as they get more engagement, they also tend to move up in the rankings for search engines. So it's a process that requires some patience because it may take 3 to 6 months after making SEO improvements for it to pay off. So that's why you should get started now. And it really depends too on how competitive the subject matter is. So if there aren't that many people out there who are competing with similar content to yours, you may see results faster. Some people could even see improvements in a matter of a few weeks. But it's important to keep tracking it over time because SEO is not a one and done kind of thing. It's definitely a maintenance thing over time. And you also have to keep in mind that the results here may not always be linear. As search engines update their algorithms or a new website enters your space that has similar content, it's possible that your SEO improvements could have a lesser effect over time, so it needs to be sustained. So with that, I think we've pretty extensively covered what SEO is, what metadata are, and the three-step process for making improvements there. So at this time, I will hand off to Darren Goldberg, who's on the line, who's going to talk a little bit more about really some of this measurement piece, how you look at your web analytics to measure traffic and engagement on your website. So I will pass it over to you, Darren.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Just a reminder before I get going, remember the chatbot is there. So for anyone who had questions followed up from Josh's great presentation or my upcoming talk about web traffic and engagement, feel free to use that. As Josh said, a quick introduction, I'm Darren Goldberg, and I focus a lot on digital analytics and dealing with web traffic and engagement. So what we're going to do is jump right into that. What is kind of some common themes from analytics today? Here are some big things you may hear from a lot of things. You know, data is more important than ever. When we're trying to make good business decisions, you hear from a lot of places that they are very data-driven, and I want to be a culture of making data-driven decisions. Well, a lot of that comes from the infrastructure of your setup to make sure you have everything tagged correctly. We'll get into that a little bit more and talk about what things are important to track and why that's trackable. The difference is there's so many things to look at. And from an analytics perspective, there's a lot of data sources. There's a lot of data metrics to make sure. How do you know what the right things are? It does require some thought and some planning. So we'll also talk about that as well. Another key thing is understanding what a representation between from a leadership perspective and from other team perspectives of how you represent or how you're tracking what your goals are and what key performance indicators are. So you may have a goal of this website, of an awareness goal, but a key performance indicator might be something like a download to make sure of that. So if we have something along that, you want to make sure things are in sync and then all team members understand the connection between all of that. So you're not tracking things that are not aligned to your business goals. And one thing that's always very important from an analytics, and it's kind of, in a weird way, like a stereotype of analytics, right? Stereotype from analytics is more of a reporting standpoint, and people come to you after things and tell me how things performed and how we did on certain things. The important thing that I'm going to stress a lot today is an upfront involvement from analytics. Analytics, with being a data-driven culture, can help really determine kind of the blueprint of what you're trying to do, especially from a strategic standpoint. Leveraging that from data, that helps by doing that. So you'll see that a little bit more as well. But let's start from the beginning, right? Let's talk about what digital and web analytics is. What that is we're talking about measuring data, collecting it, analyzing, and reporting all that. What you're trying to get out of that is for the end user to make sure they understand site behavior and usage of that activity, but your goal is really to optimize through. It's not just measuring things that talks about I'm on your site and I can tell you how many users got there. But like the example you see here, there's a lot of different sources that can bring people to your site. As Josh talked about earlier, a good chunk of that could be from organic traffic from web search, but also could be other tactics as well, paid search activity, social media, newsletters, webinars and conferences, right? There are a lot of people that drive people to your site. The difference is understanding each of those groups and trying to understand their unique behaviors and how they perform on your website. What's the real value of having analytics, right? It's great from a reporting standpoint, but as I talked about in the beginning, right, if you want to be more of a data-driven culture, you want to make good, smart business decisions by leveraging data. Here are some things you would do that for, right? You look at data and you're trying to identify what works and what doesn't work. If you put certain content on a page or a video on a page you want people to view, do people look at that? Do they not look at that? Do people find your content appealing? It also talks from analytics. It can also help from a design standpoint. We have a big promotion you're talking about or a new release of something, but maybe you put it in the wrong part of the page. What this can also help is design and develop with use of tools like A/B testing tools, which can help move content, change language, and test different things that you're doing on these pages to give you more informed decisions, because it can tell you from a layout perspective or a site structure perspective where people go, what do they click on, what do they not click on. So at the end of the day, we talked about before what your goals are. You want to streamline the process to get people to where they need to go. We talked about the third one, right? You really want to make sure when you get people to your site, you make it a very clear path of where they're going. You want to test those concepts. It's never just set it and forget it. You always want to keep optimizing that experience to make sure, because your audiences always could potentially change, and you're always adding different content. You don't just launch it and never add anything. So you want to make sure you're on top of all the changes you're making. And it also helps decide of understanding where your users go and what they digest on the site. How do you spend your money? Right? Where do you focus all your attention on, especially based on what people are doing and what they're not doing on the site? Also talks about, that's great, but these are other things analytics can answer for you. We talked about optimizing the user experience of if we had certain content at the bottom, we want to promote our special data section on our site, and nobody clicks on that. Maybe there's an opportunity to optimize it because we're seeing that from the user experience. People don't go there. Maybe we test that concept to move that somewhere else on the page where we know people do click on. What about opportunities that we want to align to our goals? If we want people to download these reports, I don't want the report 6-7 pages deep in your website structure. How am I going to find that? You know, the goal is, if you understand kind of the ideal path of where people take, you can help optimize the experience along the way that aligns to those goals of what you do want people to get out of it. Because at the end of the day, you don't want people to come to your site and not do what you don't want them to do, right? If they come there and everybody goes on one page and leave, yeah, I could come up with examples to tell you in some certain circumstances that's okay. But for the most part, that's not. And what you want to really do is make sure the work that you're doing drives people there. But the whole point of data, right, is to try to prove all the work you're doing is you can measure that, and you can prove, you can kind of get, you may have heard a term of ROI, which is a return on investment. That's what you're really doing. If I spent this much money on a site design, or I put these kind of money into creating videos, I want to know people are digesting them, and I want to make sure I can track that behavior to know that, yep, we spent this amount of money and we got this amount of results. That's really the secret sauce of analytics. But as we talked about in the beginning, we talked about, you know, making sure your analytics structure is set up. So you look at it from a foundational standpoint. And in this regard, there's really kind of 3 points. The first part is the configuration. So you want to make sure that whatever analytics platform you're using, for an example, like a Google Analytics, you want to make sure it's set up correctly. And everything that you're setting up, there's a standard implementation, and there's always a customizations. And some of the customizations work into some of the goals you have. So, example, like I keep using, if you want to do downloads, you may create a special customization within your platform to track these kind of behaviors. But you want to make sure you set that up in time up front, because, you know, most of these tools, when you set it up, they don't retroactively go back in time to track that kind of behavior, where maybe you had your code set up in June, but you didn't set up your downloads until August. You can't go back to the June report and be like, well, where's my downloads? It doesn't work that way. So a lot of things are not retroactive in that regards. But once you get your configuration and your architecture set up right, you want to monitor and measure things. You get this kind of reports. You want to make sure people you're establishing kind of patterns and baselines, because at the end of the day, if you're reporting out to people and you see a site and you have, wow, we got 5,000 visits this month, without a baseline, how do you know if that's good or not? Maybe that's great, but maybe it was 500 last month. Maybe it was 5 million last month, right? Without those kind of baselines to establish patterns, you don't really know what's good and what's not good. You're also doing that from a monitoring standpoint, because there are going to be, as we talked about on one of the other slides, about key performance indicators. Those are things you really are going to want to monitor over time. Those things should align more to your goals, to be like when you're monitoring activity, you want to see how those interact. You want to make sure how those change. Some things, obviously, you want to look at more frequently than others, but some of those key performance indicators you do. The difference is then when you have that and you're monitoring it, you want to then analyze the behavior of what's happening. Maybe we saw a spike in traffic, and that spike in traffic was because you sent out a newsletter. And that spike in that traffic because of the newsletter led to people reading this content. And then knowing they read that content maybe comes up with an action plan of being like, you know, a lot of people who got that newsletter focused on this topic area. That might be something we want to focus on more. So you can see how leveraging analytics can tie into this, besides just telling you, yep, we got 50 clicks on that email, versus tying in and telling a whole story. Speaking of a story, we're going to talk a little bit more, and I have a different story to share, which I'm going to guess people have heard something like this before. It's a very common story that I hear a lot from many jobs that I've had. We'll have a task, and an analytics task might be, you know, we have to deliver a monthly report to a client. And that manual, it's a monthly report, and it's a manual process. So by the time we have somebody here who's pulling numbers and going to multiple sources, you may have it where I'm doing June's data, for example, and maybe you're not seeing the June's report until 7 to 14 days after because I'm manually pulling things together. And then once I deliver that report, it goes to our client. And that client may have this whole report, and maybe 5, 10, 20 pages, whatever it is. And they look at maybe 3 or 4 numbers, and they're going to copy and paste these numbers, and they're going to give it in a different report and send it to their boss, who then may take those numbers and copy and paste that and do it for their boss and send it out. The difference is this is also probably a cycle that just keeps going and going, hence the rinse, lather, repeat sort. The difference is this is a story that I've heard a lot with that kind of scenario. However, we should really try to rewrite that story a little bit, right? The difference from an analytics part is there's a lot of it that can people clump in, and it's a reporting standpoint. Reporting really should be to the point of we should be able to automate that process the best we can. There are tools out there that can help automate dashboards for you that where if you were looking for June's numbers, you should be able to go there July 1st. I don't even care if that's a Saturday or Sunday. It's all web-based, and you should be able to look at that when you need that. We should be able to do that regardless. You want to monitor those. You want those numbers where you should be able to get 24/7 access. It shouldn't depend on our schedule. It should be the other way around. So having data available to you gives you that flexibility. But instead of spending the time pulling automated reports, what we should be doing is then telling you the story behind the numbers. Imagine what happens now if you go back to that story and you deliver a report out where the story is, well, maybe this increased. Instead of saying, you know, our users increased 15%, you say something like our users increased 15% because of this newsletter we sent out, and those people went to this content, and our recommendation is to focus on content like that. Imagine how much better that story sounds compared to just saying, here's a number. So knowing all this, what do you do next, right? This sounds like a lot, but you got to kind of start from the very beginning, and the beginning again is you want to define really what you want to measure. Now, understand a platform like Google and Adobe and other analytic platforms, they're pretty good. They have a lot of right out of the box metrics that you can use, but you do want to define what is considered success. You just need to define that up front before you start using any of these platforms. For you, if you go to this and be like, what's the goal of my website? What are the goal? If I had people come to my site, what do I consider a good visit to be? What do I want people to do? That's kind of your first step in defining what you should measure. Then what you'll do is come up with a platform to make sure you set that up and you track those correctly. So as you can see in the example, if I define downloads of a report is an important thing I want, then make sure that when you set up whatever analytics software you do, you are also tracking downloads as well, because that's a key indicator of success for you. When you define those things, you want to make sure you align a measurement plan that you're tracking. So you want to make sure that not only is it, I want to know how many downloads this report got, that report may be on multiple pages, so you may want to show that by pages as well. So you understand, oh, okay, similar to something like Josh was talking about in the beginning about there may be, when you look at your SEO audit, there may be hundreds of pages, but people go to the top 20, right? This could be something very similar, that download may be on 50 pages, but only people download them for 2. Maybe it's a good usage of your resources to focus then on those 2 pages of how you optimize the experience or change the experience, knowing that from some of those other pages, people are not doing what you expected to do. And then the reality is, similar to getting baselines and benchmarks, it takes some time to accumulate data. You want to probably give it about at least a month to get at least a stable baseline to start making comparisons to what you're going to say. So when you talk about metrics, what are some key things you look at, right? So there are kind of 4 big things I like to focus on. Look, at the top, you look at kind of overall traffic, and then you look at traffic. So when you're looking at it like by users or visits, you're also going to look at that by key pages on it. So when you look at things at an aggregate level, that's great. But the real secret sauce to everything is you want to know by some key pages that people look at. That's also important. But the key is before you even get there, how do they get there, right? And as Josh talked about before, using organic search is a big one. But there are other channels we've talked about. There's email, there's social media, and it's understanding how each of those channels interact with your site. Once they get to your site, how do they navigate through? That's identifying user pathways, of understanding the key pathways people take. And then what you kind of look at as a one, it's maybe not the greatest image, but it looks like a funnel. And it's really identifying what more of your happy path is, of knowing that people came to this home page and then went to this content page and went to this report page and downloaded it. The key is you have more information about people who don't do the happy path versus doing the happy path. How do you identify that and move people to your target? Because at the end of the day, your targets are goals, and your goals might be a download or watch a video. And the goals and then the custom events could be more from an engagement standpoint of, I want to track how people click on this. Do they expand content? If we write an article and it says click here to read more, how many people click to read more? Those are the kind of things you're looking at. So in a little more details of what some of those things are, right? Traffic sources we talked, they're more like channels. So think of it that way, of when you have channels go through, that's what traffic sources are. We talked about kind of traffic by overall and by page. You want to really understand what content people digest the most and the least. So make sure that you understand where to drive people to. Josh talked a lot about this, about search engines and terms that people can use. Understanding what people type in and then what their end result is very helpful for people to understand that connectivity to make sure their journey works the way they do. Goals and events, again, you want to really understand that if you're trying to fill something out, fill out a form, you're downloading something, there are certain actions you want people to do on a site. You want to make sure you track that accordingly. And then again, like we talked about, once a user path is going to be more when people come to the site, where do they go and why do they go the way they go. We talked a little bit about outreach tactics of email. I just wanted to show an example, and one thing we do is you can track things that come from off your site to your site, and it's using parameters called UTMs, which Google calls Urgent Tracking Module parameters. Yeah, it's a mouthful, but just remember it's what they're called are UTMs, and what they do are they're query string parameters, and most people, I'm going to guess, when you open up your own personal emails and you get an email like something you see here on the screen, this will probably show my love of golf here, but what it also shows is they do a good job at this. So it's going to be really hard to read in what's highlighted in yellow, but they use these UTM parameters. And what they track is every specific click on an email. And if you moused over every single one of these, each one of these changes a little bit. So what that gives them is the behavior of when you're sending out an email, you can better understand what people are interacting with, what contents they click on, if they're multiple, and it gives you a better way to do more detailed testing. The key is when you use these kind of outreach tactics, this is an example of just using email, but you can use these tactics for anything. So if you're at a conference and you're giving out a flyer, right, and you give a URL, like a vanity URL, that's going to redirect. So you'll see that on times where maybe it will be like whatever.gov/report, right? And when you go there and you type that mailing, your browser is going to redirect, and that redirect is going to have these parameters in place. That's then to make sure you understand what tactics are driving people there. That's really important to understand, because what you want to be able to do is separate people who come organically versus some of the outreaches you're performing and get a better understanding of that audience. We've talked about a little bit about some of the tools that are here. Google has a great suite of free products to get started with. There are a lot of others. I don't want to say that we work for Google and we're just promoting Google products. There are a lot of other great products. You'll see in a little bit, we'll talk about Christy will talk about some of the playbooks that have been created, and there's a lot more other those tools that you can read more about to get that. Here are some examples of this. I won't go into a ton of details. We've already kind of talked about Google Analytics. It tracks your behavior. Josh talks about the Search Console a bit. It really gives you a lot of organic traffic behavior activity. Google Tag Manager is a way to manage your tracking of your tags. Instead of manually putting it on a page, you can use your tag management system to have non-technical people be able to implement tags on a code. Data Studio is one thing we use for a lot of clients. It's Google's dashboard visualization tool that can translate data from Google Analytics or any other platform and can visualize that in a dashboard format. And Google Optimize, you heard me talk about A/B testing before. This is really one of their free platforms that also helps you do A/B testing and redirect tests as well. And in conclusion, I'm just going to talk about 5 quick things from an analytics perspective that I just really want you to kind of remember, take away from this. The first one is when we talk about your destination is important, don't lose sight of how you're getting there, right? We talk about goals and what your end goal is, but understand there's a journey to that and make sure you don't ignore that where you just focus on users and downloads. There's a lot that happens in between. The second point is ask yourself, now what? If you don't, we will. Who's the we? Yeah, I might be that we, but it might be that person in your organization who's responsible for this kind of activity of tracking this kind of behavior. You should probably always look at things where it's not, you know, analytics is a cycle. It always keeps going, and if you focus on just the journey from point A to point B, there's always something else you want people to do, and just make sure of now that you got people to your website, so think of it from an outreach, you drove people to the site, then the answer is now what? And then you got them to the site and they clicked on this page, now what? And if you got them to download a report, how do you know if they liked the report, if it was helpful, right? There's always another question you can ask. And again, the third point is if you don't know where to start defining your SaaS, again, we talked about this earlier, ask yourself what you would want to know, what would be a good visit for you, and visualize things from a funnel perspective of step-by-step basis. And start yourself small. There's no right or wrong answer to it. It's just understanding to make sure you identify what the right steps are to understand what success means to you on the site and take it small steps instead of thinking of a big picture. Another thing is when you go to whoever that analytics person is, and just say, well, we're going to track everything, we'll get back to it later. You know, the answer is you're not going to. It's because there's a lot of data. We talked about that in my very first slide. There's just a lot of data points. Just make sure you focus on the right ones because that's why we say it's very important to align to your key measures and your goals. And then the last point is, look, analytics is confusing. This is why I have a job. This is why I do what I do. I would always invite anybody to ask questions, ask to someone like myself, ask to your counterparts at work, because if you have the question, I'm going to guess other people have the same question. The worst question you have is the one you don't ask. So never be afraid to ask those questions because that's the only way you're going to learn. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and I'm going to pass off to Christy to close this out.
Great. Thank you, Darren, and thank you, Josh. And, oops, I went too fast. Nope, sorry. Hang with me. The really great news about this webinar is that hot off the presses, we have 2 supporting documents and resources that really accompany the conversation that you've heard today. And these resources are really great and explain best practices that may be something that you want to pass along to your team members that would actually be doing this work so that they would have it in their, I guess, toolbox as you all work on your consumer education websites and build them out. So me being a program person, I'm really thankful that they are resources like this because it is a lot of information to absorb and learn about. So they are available for your use when you get ready to do that. Also, I just want to remind you all that there are a few questions that have come in the chat box, and we appreciate those. I have posted an email, capacitybuildingcenter@icfi.com, for questions that may come in as you distribute this information among your team members and they use the 2 resource documents that I just talked about. There may be some questions that they have, and if they're not on the call today, they can use this email to send in their questions or their comments. And then we're going to have a follow-up webinar specifically on today's topic, 30 minutes on July 25th. And any questions that come in, we will address those on that day. So that is another avenue for you to be able to get information and for people who are not on the call today to have their questions answered. We're going to move along and we are going to complete another poll. We're going to take a few minutes and have you guys complete another poll. And what we want to do is just for you to answer this question: how much has your understanding of this topic improved today? I realize that it is a technical topic, but we want to kind of gauge what the audience is feeling. Okay, great. Thank you guys for completing that poll. The next one that we would like to ask you to answer is: how likely are you to use these strategies in your future work on your consumer education website? Or how likely would your team of people in your agency use these strategies? If you guys could answer that, we'd be very appreciative. Okay. And then the other thing that we want to ask is, what other webinar topics would be of specific interest to you or your team? And you can just type your answers in. We're going to give it just a minute or two more for people to finish up. Okay, great. We're going to move on. Hang on one second. So I wanted to remind everyone, so we do have the Ask Me Anything that's going to be coming up on the 25th of July to specifically deal with questions that came from today's webinar. But then our next hot topic webinar is the top 10 actions to improve your website content and design. And that is scheduled for August the 8th, 2019 from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. And there are a lot of different audiences that may benefit from attending this webinar, and that would be your state and territory CCDF administrators or co-administrators or R&R staff, early childhood training and technical assistance providers, a wide population that really may benefit from learning about the top 10 actions. There is a registration link at the bottom where people can register. If there's if someone has trouble registering or needs help with that, you can use the email that I put in the box earlier today, and we can get that information out to you all. We are now at time. We're about 3 minutes over. I do want to take the opportunity to thank everybody for attending the webinar today. I hope that it was beneficial to you all, and we certainly hope that you or members of your team will join us in the Ask Me Anything follow-up webinar and also on the next webinar, which is the top 10 actions. So thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.